very good afternoon to everyone. I welcome you all to the Seminar Series 2013 organized by Department of Sociology, South Asian University. India and South Asia, as we all know, has been dubbed as a fertile ground for studying issues related to caste, class and gender. And today's seminar is about politics and sexuality in South Asia. Without wasting much time, I take extreme privilege in introducing our speaker for this seminar, Professor Nivedita Menon. Professor Nivedita Menon does not need any introduction. She's self-explanatory, but as a student, I am tempted to speak about her informally. Professor Menon has an account of vast scholarship which includes works such as Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond the Law, Power and Contestation, India since 1989, Global History of the Present. Her latest work, Seeing Like a Feminist, is a bold and wide-ranging book that records contemporary notion of feminism. In addition to her illustrious scholarships, she is also known as a dynamic, impactful and engaging teacher. I have learned from some of my seniors and friends that there has been a cult of Professor Menon in LSR, Delhi University. Every student who attended her class wanted to be like her or think like her. The magnetic personality of a teacher, which we all students value, is in Professor Menon. I'm sure in today's discussion, we will at every moment relish the charismatic energy that she executes. In the chair today, we have Dr. R.J. Harshay, Professor, Department of International Relations, South Asian University. His field of interest are theories of international relations, globalization and development, and comparative and area studies with reference to Afro-Asian countries and Indian foreign policy. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. I also welcome our discussant for the seminar, Dr. Diya Mehra, Professor, Department of Sociology, South Asian University. Finally, Parveen Hussain, student, MA, Delhi, Department of Sociology, South Asian University, is the rapporteur for the seminar. Now I request Dr. Rajan Harshay to please chair the... Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. I also join here in welcoming Nivedita. I have had the privilege of hearing her while I was in Hyderabad. She delivered 2 lectures in a program that I was coordinating, and I can tell you that they were absolutely first-rate lectures. Subsequently, we have had meetings here and there, and I have also been reading her like many of you. So, like all of you, I am waiting to hear her. So let me not stand between you and the speaker. I hand over to Nivedita. Please. Yeah,
Thank you so much. I'm really very happy to be here. It's a very exciting idea for me that there is a South Asian University in Delhi, and I'm told that a large percentage of the students are actually from different countries of South Asia, so I'm really very thrilled to be here. And thank you for that really generous introduction. I think it's the sweetest introduction I've had ever, so thank you. The title of my talk is Sexuality Movements in South Asia, but I must confess right at the outset that I haven't researched each separate country of South Asia at any length, so I will refer briefly to some aspects of sexuality movements in some of the countries that I'm familiar with, and I would be in fact very happy to be better advised if there are students here from those regions who might know better about the movements in those countries. So the entry point is really through India, and I hope to reflect a little bit on the region, and eventually one should really do a larger project to take sexuality movements in South Asia seriously. So, so this paper is largely based on the Indian experience, but there will be references throughout to larger experiences in the region. So just to begin with a quick overview of some South Asian countries other than India, so that we know where we are, what we're talking about. I think most of us know that in 2012, Nepal became the only South Asian country to grant separate recognition to its community of sexual minorities based on their gender identities. So the Nepalese Home Ministry now provides citizenship under the Others category to members of Nepal's LGBTI, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex community. This motion comes 5 years after the Nepali Supreme Court asked the government to frame equal laws for LGBTIs. And I think many of us also know that Sunil Babu Pant, who is South Asia's first openly gay legislator, he actually praised this legislation, which grants separate recognition to the community of LGBTI. I will come back to whether this is in fact the best strategy for a queer politics and what could be the problems with recognizing LGBTI as a separate citizenship category. So I'll come back to some of those, the problem with that later, but at the moment I think we could reflect on the sheer shock value of recognizing this identity at all in terms of citizenship. And several high-profile transgender Nepalis are also associated with Nepali parties, from Nepali Congress to the Maoists. So Nepal is really, in that sense, the most high-profile sort of success story in the region of official recognition for LGBTI identities. We also need to remember that most countries, all countries of Asia and Southeast Asia and so on, which have been under colonial rule, British colonial rule, have the exact same sodomy laws, anti-sodomy laws. And they're all called Section 377. India, of course, Malaysia, Singapore, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Maldives, Jamaica, all have the exact same Section 377, which criminalizes sexual acts against the order of nature. And almost all the Commonwealth nations have sodomy laws based on, when I say sodomy laws, I mean anti-sodomy laws. The very use of this term sodomy, you must realize, is very loaded. Because sodomy simply refers to anal sex. But somehow when you use the term sodomy, there is an implication of rape, as if you can never have sodomy by consent. So if you notice the way newspapers report some incidents of, let's say, child abuse, they say he has been arrested for sodomy. Not for, basically, non-consensual sex with a child, right? So the use of the term sodomy is this sort of vile, vicious-looking term, which is produced in such a way that you can never imagine sodomy by consent. So sodomy itself is treated as a crime in all of these places that I talked about. So if you look at, for example, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, homosexuality is a crime under these similar provisions, and it's socially taboo. But both in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, there are movements. There are NGOs. So in Sri Lanka, there's Equal Ground, an NGO called Equal Ground. In Bangladesh, you have the Bandhu Social Welfare Society, and there's this website LGBTI Bangladesh. These are, resources one could look at. So both in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, there are these kinds of efforts to talk about LGBTI issues. In Pakistan, homosexuality is illegal through two sources. One is the Anglo-Saxon law that we just talked about, but the other is the Sharia. So both through Islamic and through colonial laws, homosexuality is illegal. All South Asian countries have very vibrant gay subcultures, but the explicit official mode of addressing LGBT issues is generally through the lens of HIV/AIDS, which we'll come back to in the context of India. But when you address a particular kind of field of sexuality through a disease, and in the language of disease prevention, you can see that it could have a lot of, it's actually a deeply problematic lens through which to do it, but it also says a lot for our societies that it is only because of AIDS that sex becomes speakable. It's only because of the fear of HIV/AIDS that you can actually talk about sex at all. So that we need to think about what that means. That is actually a disease that enables us to have a discussion on sex. Now when you come to India, and I will, as I said, largely focus on India in this presentation, it's in the 90s really that a range of political assertions that I term counter-heteronormative acquire a sense of autobiography. What I mean by this is that in the 90s you find counter-heteronormative movements. I will explain counter-heteronormative, what I mean by that in a minute. But we find that in the 90s histories start getting written. So when I say a sense of autobiography, I mean there is a self-conscious understanding that we are a movement. When did this term homosexuality come into being? What did we call ourselves before? How old is homosexuality in India? These kinds of questions start getting asked, and when history starts being written, we recognize the birth of a movement. And so that moment is the 1990s. So I'm actually going to try and do two things in this paper. I'm going to briefly track these movements, but I'm equally interested in looking at, from the standpoint of feminist politics, I really want to destabilize feminist politics by engaging with the implications of the politics of counter-heteronormative movements. So when I use the term counter-heteronormative, I'm referring to a range of political assertions that implicitly or explicitly challenge heteronormativity, that is the idea that heterosexuality is natural and normal. And so a range of political assertions that either implicitly or explicitly challenge heteronormativity and the institution of monogamous patriarchal marriage. So once you define counter-heteronormative like that, you can see a range of movements as fitting into this definition. You have, of course, such assertions then, largely they sort of come together around the demand for the repeal of Section 377, which, as I said, penalizes sexual acts against the order of nature. That's the terminology. But also, within this, I would put various kinds of political action around issues related to the lives and civil liberties of hijras, and also, of course, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people, but also sex workers. Because I see the sex workers movement in India as also explicitly challenging the institution of monogamous patriarchal marriage. In addition, a number of sex workers are transgender people. So when I say that the moment of recognizing yourself as a movement begins in the 1990s, I should make it clear that I'm not saying that non-heterosexual or counter-heteronormative practices started in the 1990s. I'm not saying that. It should be clear that I'm making a distinction between everyday practices on the one hand, and on the other, the narrativizing of these practices in a particular mode. That is, people have lived their lives in all kinds of ways. But there is a moment at which there is a narrative, there's a story that begins to be told. If we look at nation formation across the world, but of course in South Asia, you'll see there's a moment at which, and all of us know for our parts of the world when that is, there's a moment at which a nation is posited as going back for 200 years, and usually that moment is the 19th century. So that signifies a nationalist movement, the big birth of a nationalist movement. Similarly, the narrativizing of practices in a particular mode, that of modern history writing, I do want to make that distinction. So, because there could, in everyday lives, people have lived for centuries as individuals and in communities, overtly or covertly, violating dominant norms. So I'm obviously not saying that homosexuality suddenly pops up in India in the 1990s. I'm saying that these various ways in which people live their lives, it's from the 1990s that the histories begin to be traced. This is the period from which something like a movement acquires a self-identity, increasing visibility and confidence. So the distinction here is that between everyday practices that are not necessarily self-conscious and the selection of such practices and their welding into a historical narrative, which is a self-conscious political practice. So I'm dating the beginning of the self-conscious political counter-heteronormative movements from the 1990s. So why the 1990s? What happened in the 1990s? From about the late 80s, growing awareness about the about the AIDS, I was about to say the sex epidemic, but this is what I mean. When you say AIDS, you can get to talk about sex. Growing awareness of the AIDS epidemic made it increasingly legitimate to talk of sex outside the realm of law, demography, and medicine. As we know, and some of us may be familiar with Foucault, talking about sex, the opposite of talking about sex is not talking about sex. The opposite of talking about sex is talking about sex in all kinds of other ways. So it's not as if in India prior to the 90s sex was not talked about. What is the language of population control? It's about have sex, but have sex with condoms, right? It's about how to have sex. What is the appropriate way of having sex, and so on. So demography. So sex was talked about through demography. Sex was talked about through medicine. Sex was talked about through law. Or also against, let's say, violence against women. So sexual violence against women. So it's not that sex had not been spoken about, but with the coming of the AIDS epidemic, paradoxically, it became possible to talk about sex in terms of desire. This is the strange and peculiar paradox that here is this disease, AIDS, and as a result of AIDS, you can talk about sex not in these ways, but it opens up the possibility to talk about sex as desire. So although AIDS is of course a disease which fits into medical discourse, the source of AIDS made sex itself speakable. So for example, a highly political left-wing non-funded group supporting rights of homosexuals, by non-funded I hope you understand that I'm referring to a very specific, explicit political stand that we will not take funding, so it's not an NGO. So it's a movement which is not an NGO. So there was this group called the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan, which filed a petition against Section 377 in 1992. So AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan can be translated as movement against AIDS-based discrimination, and you can see that AIDS here is acting as a code for homosexuality. That is, it's actually became a support group for gay people. And so it's highly political, it's left-wing, it's non-funded, but it's using this innocuous term AIDS at that time, in 1992. You find that sex workers' unions, highly radical militant sex workers' unions such as the Durbar Mahila Samanvay Committee in Calcutta, the Sampada Grami Mahila Parishad Sangram in Sangli, Maharashtra. Now how did they start? How did these sex workers' unions start? They started as peer education programs distributing condoms as part of an HIV control project. They began as HIV control groups, but they now function like extremely militant trade unions, protecting their members in various ways, organizing street demonstrations, initiating legal action against political violence, against police violence, and standing up to local criminals. International funding for HIV/AIDS prevention played a significant role in the creation of new NGOs dealing with sexuality, or funded sexuality programs in old ones. Now, what I'm trying to show is that even though the entry of talk about sexuality is via AIDS, what we actually find is that, and this is something that we should always understand, that it doesn't always remain in the control of the intention of the funders. So yes, there is a way in which funding can tame radical politics, but there is also a way in which there are spaces for the escape of politics from the control of funders. So you have these, you have a large number of funding for things like, for example, telephone helplines, safe spaces, and so on. But what it did was it opened up the floodgates for the political articulation of non-normative sexualities. Autonomous groups had, since the late 1970s, had discussions on sexuality, including lesbian sexuality, and links with international women's groups. But AIDS awareness finally helped to produce a critical mass of such an understanding in the public realm in India. It provided the opening and the monetary resources for public articulation of issues around sexuality, workshops and meetings providing often startlingly new perspectives, bringing together people from all over the country with international participants, and mobilizing for such politics at a countrywide level. So why 1990s? One key reason is, in fact, paradoxically, AIDS funding. the funding for AIDS, which actually opened up the possibility, which doesn't, and I'm not saying this to delegitimize the queer movement in India. I'm saying that it actually produced the space for a genuine radical politics to emerge. Another factor which doesn't mean that all of it is like this. There is a lot of AIDS funding related work which is simply about use of condoms, and it's very, very mainstream. But we'll come back to these issues in a moment. Now, another factor that in the 1990s made sexuality visible in public spaces, both elite and non-elite, was the opening up of the media in the 1990s. This is also something I think all of us mark as part of the marketization of the Indian economy. Sexually explicit and suggestive images from the West flowed in through private cable television channels, affecting a certain degree of banalization of the hitherto unspeakable. You're sitting at dinner with your parents and you're watching an ad for sanitary napkins, which is the most innocent actually of the images that you actually see. So it just becomes banal, it becomes everyday. Images of women in bikinis, images of people apparently having all kinds of non-normative kinds of relationships, not necessarily non-heterosexual, but relationships outside marriage. There are American cinema, there's American TV, and so on and so forth. So sexuality becomes visible in public spaces. This is another thing that happens in the 1990s, and the opening up of the media is part of that. So I'm reminded here of one of Foucault's interviews in which he pointed out that as power produces appropriate bodies, in counter-response emerge claims and affirmations, those of one's own body against power. So in response to, as power produces appropriate bodies, in counter-response, we affirm our own body against power. But in return, power responds precisely to this revolt. For instance, economically and ideologically by exploiting eroticization, by selling everything from suntan products to pornographic films. So power used to say, don't show your body, and you said, I'll show my body. Then power responded by saying, okay, get undressed, but be slim, good-looking, tanned. Thus, says Foucault, for each move by one adversary, there is an answering one by the other. One has to recognize the indefiniteness of the struggle. So the point here is to say that when you look, if we use a kind of an older left or an older, more conventional feminist perspective, then there's a way in which either moments of politics are perfectly radical or there are moments which are perfectly unradical. They're either to be not engaged with at all or they can be fully engaged with. And I think what I'm suggesting is that we have to see that every space has potential for radicalism and every radical space has a potential for conservatism. This is actually what one is trying to say, that there is an indefiniteness of the struggle. While AIDS activism as it arose in the US and other Western countries was an intrinsic part of gay political activism and had to challenge traditional modes of empowering knowledge as well as traditional modes of authorizing and legitimizing power, in India, AIDS prevention is in effect the point at which what Foucault would have called disciplinary power and biopowers normalizing techniques intersect. The official discourse of HIV/AIDS control and the funding generated by it is extremely state-centric and is about new ways of regulating and controlling sexuality and the population as a whole. However, its effects are uncontrollable and spill over into forms of radicalization it could not have predicted or desired. At the same time, the discourse itself, as well as funding imperatives, can also tame radicalism and normalize once non-normative forms of sex with new rules and regulations. That is, you are now told sex outside marriage is okay, homosexuality is okay, as long as it's safe sex. So new set of rules emerge. Sexual identities like Kothi tend to get reified by NGOs whose continued funding depends on the numbers that they have outreach with. Competition for funding can splinter solidarity and focus on AIDS can be narrowly health-related and depoliticized. So one does indeed have to recognize the indefiniteness of the struggle. The presence of large numbers of NGOs receiving funding for AIDS-related work makes it necessary to maintain a distinction between a political practice that is consciously counter-hegemonic and the increasingly acceptable discourse about homosexuality produced in the context of AIDS prevention. And yet it is often the case that counter-hegemonic voices are able to tip the scales within a constellation produced by a range of ideas and circumstances external to themselves. Such a moment is, for example, Deepa Mehta's film Fire, which by itself, we could discuss it, many of you may have seen it, whether it is itself a radical film. Every single person in the film has made sure to say that this is not a film about lesbianism. One can have problems with a film which shows lesbianism as arising only because the men are so terrible. But that is not the point. Something else happened, something that was beyond and above fire. So when Fire was, as you know, it depicts a sexual affair between sisters-in-law in a... Have you all seen Fire? Sexual affair between the sisters-in-law in a traditional Hindu household. Fire was attacked violently by the Hindu right. What happens is you find a constellation of forces that come together to, it was a catalyst for public demonstrations in defense of freedom of expression and against homophobia on the streets of Mumbai and Delhi and many other cities of a size and visibility unknown before in India. Public statements about and in support of and against homophobia. And if you look at who came together in these demonstrations, there were opponents of the Hindu right, there were defenders of freedom of expression, there were human rights activists, gay and lesbian activists, and of course many or all of these categories overlap, right? There are gay and lesbian activists who are defenders of freedom of expression, and so on. So there was a coming together of a variety of voices. So 90s, this is what happens in the 90s. There is a coming together of a variety of what could be in fact a conservative kind of intervention, what could have been in fact extremely just a kind of the pathologizing of AIDS. All of that actually, something escapes all of that and something happens in the 90s, and so you have in a sense the birth of the self-conscious and now I call it queer movement, which brings us to the question of history and naming. What do you call, what does a movement call itself? And I'm interested in looking at the questions raised for and challenges posed to feminist politics by seriously engaging with the worldview provided by these struggles. Before I go into the history question, it's important to remember that the criminalization of same-sex activity is, as we said, a legal provision introduced in the 19th century. And over the 19th century, heterosexuality was naturalized on this subcontinent, in which two opposed tendencies, British colonial interventions, and the emergence of different notions of the nation flowed together to produce the same effect. There is abundant scholarship which establishes that the delegitimation of homosexual desire and the production of the naturally heterosexual, properly bigendered, unambiguously male or female population of citizens, with the women respectively desexualized, is a process that is central to nation formation all over the globe. And if you think of each of your contexts, you will see whether Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nepal or any other country, the coming into being of a nation has involved the production of this idea of a naturally heterosexual, properly bigendered population of citizens with respectively desexualized women. There's some very interesting work from Iran. Afsane Najmabadi also talks about it in the context of Iran. So there's actually all over South and West Asia, you find this as a process. Now this erasure over a century, the erasure of histories of homoeroticism over a century was so complete that when the Hindu right-wing attack takes place in 1998, they can actually say that this is homosexuality is not Indian. And in fact, they say it is as a result of Western and Islamic aberrations into Hindu/Indian society. That's the kind of argument the Hindu right-wing is able to make. But in a moment, we will see how you can have a Hindu right-wing gay lesbian voice. So I'm trying to continuously, I hope, what I'm trying to do is to show you how today when we look at politics, we have to look at each moment in terms of the different counter effects that are being produced and the different countervailing forces that are taking place. When you look at the question of history and naming, the kind of arguments made by Ruth Vanithan, Salim Kidwai, Geeti Tharani and so on, who actually studied historically over centuries the cultural and linguistic resources around homosexuality, there are any number of terms that exist, which they have pointed out. These terms often, they are completely heterogeneous over the subcontinent. In different parts of the subcontinent, different terms are used. They often refer to specific practices of homosexual sex. So they're actually very explicit terms referring to acts of sex. But there have been words. There have been words and there have been terms for these practices in our societies. But as a result of but what happens is when homoeroticism it was erased throughout the 19th century, these terms then become either they fall by the wayside, they get lost, or they remain as merely as terms of abuse. They become transformed into terms of abuse. So what happens is in the late 90s then, when the movement emerges, it's like, what do you call homosexuality in Hindi? Then you make up this word, samlaingikta, जो कि कोई मतलब बोलचाल में कोई इस शब्द का इस्तेमाल नहीं करता. I realize all of you may not follow Hindi. Nobody uses this word, samlaingikta. It's a very NGO-ish term. It's a very Sanskritic produced artificial term. Or you have hamjinsi, which is an attempt to escape the Sanskritism and draw on other roots. But of course, the point is that this is a trap into. We need to say it's fine. One should say samlaingik, one should say vishamlaingik for heterosexuality. One should just use whatever words that one wants to generate. But we should not at least be under the mistaken impression that because we are trying to translate homosexuality into Indian languages, homosexuality is not an Indian practice. We have to recognize why we no longer have the language to speak about homosexuality except as a retranslatees back from English, because there's a century in which those terms and the legitimacy of those terms and the natural ways in which those terms could be used have been erased. So really what, the point is not that one should not say something. My point is that, and I think what many of us are saying, is that we need not be so defensive about the damn thing. We need not be so defensive about saying, do we have a term for homosexuality in Hindi? No. Then that means there must have been no homosexuality in India. Right? That is not the way to think about it. We have to understand histories of naming and histories of recognition. So you have actually a variety of debates. How long should I speak for? Another 15. Yeah, another 15. Because one would also like to have questions. So you have a number of debates about the relevance or otherwise of the English terms gay lesbian. So, for example, when you can have, for example, Paola Bacchetta, who has done some very interesting work on Delhi, lesbians in Delhi in the 1980s, she decided to use the term lesbians within quotes for women who she identifies as lesbians, because they love women, they live what she recognizes as lesbian lives, and she uses lesbian without quotes for women who recognize themselves as lesbians. So these are just, I mean, as young scholars, you can recognize these are also ethical, methodological practices. That when you do research, how does one do research in such a way that one doesn't, that one keeps visible one's own intervention in the field. So this is something that Paola did. And it is notable that she points out that the Delhi group that was formed in, it was just called the Delhi group. It's very, you can see the term, clearly the name was meant not to reveal too much about the group. So this was in the 80s. It was formed to study histories and experiences of lesbianism, but it omitted from its name the term lesbian, as it was a subject of disagreement, because there were also women within the group who felt comfortable, but some who felt uncomfortable. But Paola cites a women's movement activist who had at that time been living with a woman for over 10 years, as a sexual partner, living with a woman for over 10 years, who tells Bacchetta that she does not feel the term lesbian is politically useful in her context. This is a Hindi-speaking woman who tells her that along with the women of the urban slum settlement whom she worked with, she evolved this term Ekal Mahila, which simply means single woman. And she, through this term, they raised the issue of women's status outside the heterosexual institution of marriage and family. So through this term, they meant to indicate lesbians, but it could indicate celibates, it could indicate ascetics, it could indicate unmarried and divorced women, widows. Basically, the Ekal Mahila is the single woman who disrupts patriarchal genealogies in whatever way. Just her presence disrupts, her explicit presence disrupts patriarchal genealogies. So that's one kind of debate. Now there's another kind of a debate that was produced by Shivananda Khan, founder of Naz Foundation International, based in London, which is not the Naz in India. And he, there's a distinction that was introduced which he pushed via the international discourse of aid intervention, and the term began to be produced MSM, men who have sex with men, in preference for gay. So Shivananda Khan made this distinction in order, and he is seen as someone who pushed for this distinction, in order, he said, to disentangle male-to-male sexual behavior from male sexualities. And Khan suggests that in South Asia generally, male sexual behaviors exist as part of a broader sexual repertoire. And his concern is, so what he's saying is that men get married to women, they have children, they live like proper married men, but they have a range of homosexual encounters and relationships with other men. So you can't strictly call them gay. This is his point. And he would then prefer to talk about so they would be MSM, that is men who also have sex with men. Now what is he saying is that the use of the English or Western terms such as gay or homosexual, he felt, his concern is that there is very little homosexual, it would produce the understanding that if people don't identify as gay or homosexual, there is no homosexual behavior. And therefore HIV prevention programs would be limited. So he was worried about that. So you can see it's a kind of depoliticizing move deliberately, so that even if men don't say I have sex, even if men don't say they're gay, you can ask them a different kind of question in order to find out if they have sex with men, and then you can make the appropriate intervention for their health, for their continued health. But that is not his only concern. If it was very clear that his only concern was to use MSM as opposed to gay in order to designate a range of behaviors so that you can just intervene and talk about AIDS, right? That is one kind of argument, but he made a bigger argument. He said that he made a big critique of the use of terms lesbian and gay in contexts like India and in South Asia more generally. And he suggested, so he's English in terms of his citizenship, but he has there's some Bangladeshi connection in his I think his father is Bangladeshi or something like this. I'm not very sure about which of his parents, but he's English as a citizen. Now, so he's talking about this area, about our region, and he says that terms like lesbian and gay is limited to upper class circles in which diasporic lesbian and gay organizations act as, I quote, instigators of a queer India. This process he likens to sexual neocolonialism, in which Western sexual ideologies have invaded Indian discourses, so that indigenous histories and cultures become invisible. Now, immediately afterwards, he argues that the diasporic urge to seek out such histories is a form of self-justification which should not be necessary. And he says, I quote, as contemporary self-identified Indian lesbians or gay men, we shouldn't need self-validation based on a presumptive past. Now, I hope, since I've already made an earlier point, the point earlier that the use of the term homosexual, gay or lesbian is not something that suddenly happens in the 90s and we don't have, because we have nothing to do but use English for it. We have actually talked about a long history that has been erased. I hope you'll already see there's a problem here. Now, there are a number of issues that are arising. The one that one can possibly agree with is the last one, that the existence or otherwise of a history is irrelevant to the present. In other words, even if we are going to say that there is absolutely no history of homosexuality in India, but starting in 1998, there are homosexual people, fine, we should be able to accept that, right? So that's a perfect, we don't have to show a long history. There is absolutely no requisite notion that we should have, only if you have a long history can you have a legitimate identity. So yes, of course one agrees with that. But Khan does not seem to recognize that to say this is to make a political statement. That is, if you're going to say that the history does not matter, let's start now, that's a political statement. And in other words, it is already to enter into the realm of power and ethics, that is the realm of politics. And he's saying we shouldn't need self-validation. So you have to ask questions about validation by whom, of what, why. These are political questions. If this is so, there are problems with his other related assertions which hide their political nature and assume the status of factual statements. So for example, he just says, as if these are just factual statements, men in India who have sex with men do not identify themselves as gay, so the term has no relevance. B, if Indians do identify as gay lesbian, this identity is instigated by diasporic Indians. And C, this identity suppresses indigenous cultures and is a form of neocolonialism. The problem is that these assertions assume that there is a clear inside and an outside to indigenous and Western worldviews and lives, and that forms of self-identification are unchanging objective facts. Any change in self-identification in this account would involve some sort of bad faith. But of course, if we take politics seriously and identities in politics seriously, the point we need to make is that identities and self-identification are, first, socially, culturally, politically, and historically contingent. They are not natural. There is no inevitability to identities. There is a contingency which arises out of specific kinds of social, cultural, political, and historical contexts. Second, identities and self-identification are relational, always. That is, every identity derives its meaning with reference to what it is not. It's not, if you have a term homosexual, you have to have some notion of what is not homosexual. All identities are relational. And most importantly, identities and self-identification are a process. Identity and self-identification are not objective, independent facts frozen in time. Although they seem to acquire fixity at particular points, they are continuously amenable to change. And so there will continue to be everyday practices that resist both hegemonic norms as well as attempts to translate them into self-conscious counter-hegemonic movements. However, there will also be everyday practices that are amenable to being mobilized by movements. So what he's saying is, so what Khan is saying is that if you politically identify with gay lesbian, somehow you are just illegitimate straight away, because you should be part of whatever Khan is describing as indigenous culture. So what we find is there is a political discourse that has emerged in India that insists on the potential fluidity of sexual identifications and the linking of sexuality to other forms of identities as a politically productive stance. In this context, the term queer is increasingly gaining currency among activists familiar with the academic and political work in the Anglophone world, but if you at all engage with counter-heteronormative politics in India, you will find the term queer being used in Malayalam accents, in Bengali accents, in Marathi accents, in the middle of a Marathi speech, in the middle of a Malayalam speech. It's become a word, it's become an Indian word. Queer, the term queer. So what does that mean? Why is the term queer? Not everybody identifies as queer, but why has the term queer got such a balance? I think three features of the politics of the queer identity seem to emerge, and I'm saying this on the basis of a lot of writing, a lot of speaking by activists within the movement. One is that it engages with the question of biology critically, treating sexuality as fluid, not as a biological or genetic given. I have not really come across any gay gene type of, anyone in India who argues that there's a gay gene. So it's not a biological identity. Two, it does not in fact attempt to produce a new universal within which all sexual identities will be submerged. Rather, it sees queer as a political and in many ways unstable term, enabling the continuous challenge to heteronormativity, whether through gay, lesbian, transgender, feminist, or other identities. Now, there's a critique of the term queer in the West by gay theorists and lesbian feminists. We'll come back to that if you're interested in asking questions about it. And the third feature of queer politics in India, or the self-defined queer politics, is that it sees itself as complicated at its point of origin by class, caste, and community identity. Queer activists talk about class, caste, and community identity, and it's self-critical to the extent it is unable to engage with this complication. What has become what is happening is that I think there's a potential for recognition, and what queer politics is trying to do, a self-defined queer politics, is that it is not about the civil rights of LGBTI people. This is actually not, there are large sections of the women's movement which take this position. It's better than homophobia. It's better to take a position that LGBTI people have civil rights than to say it's unnatural, it's Western and all of that. But I think a more exciting and radically destabilizing position is to recognize that this politics is not about others, it is about everybody. In other words, queer politics is raising questions about the assumed naturalness and normalcy of heterosexuality. It's raising questions about how does heterosexuality gets produced as the norm. This is why you can see I am uncomfortable with. Admittedly, my understanding is very narrow, and I would be very happy to be corrected. But I am extremely uncomfortable. I think many of us in India are with this move in Nepal, which is very radical. You're recognizing them, recognizing this identity, but it will always be them, some people other than the normal us, who will be a third male, female, and non-heterosexual. This is the third category. So I think there's a serious problem here because it's leaving heterosexuality completely firmly in place as the natural thing to be, and then very generously and in like good Democrats, you're saying these guys should have rights too. So you're not turning the questioning gaze inward at all. So there's a problem there. I just want to just take another maybe 5 minutes to raise the question, to come to the question that I raised, that what does this do? What does the politics of counter-heteronormativity? So now I'm looking from the point of view of feminism, and I want to ask ourselves, what does the politics of counter-heteronormativity do to the identity, to feminist politics? What does it do to feminist politics? Because the assumed subject of feminist politics is woman. And the moment you say that feminism should be in alliance with queer movements, obviously the subject of feminist politics is no longer women in some uncomplicated sense. It's gay men, it's transgender people. What does that mean? What does it mean for feminist politics to do that? It's by no means a simple alliance between the women's movement. It's not some kind of let's all of us who are facing the brunt of patriarchy get together. Political alliances don't work like that. There are all kinds of complicated and fractured kind of alliances that we encounter. Let me give you the most obvious example, which is the alliance of hijras with the women's movement. How does one? What happens there? You might know that there are two kinds of moves by politicized hijras. One is the claim to be recognized as women. So, for example, at the World Social Forum in Mumbai, there were big banners which said hijras are women. Now, what was the context of that? The context, and the other move is to say it's a third gender. And that is also actually happens. So on passport forms, you have a third category. If you're applying for a passport, you can also say, it's not the best thing to do, but it's E for eunuch. You can say MF and E. It's not the best thing to do because, again, eunuch is a strange and it's a very pejorative term, and transgender is a preferable term. But what are the possibility of alliances between hijras and the women's movement? Now, where did this come from, this idea that hijras are women? It came in the context in 2002, two High Court judgments set aside the election of two hijras from posts reserved for women in the local body. So, People's Union for Civil Rights and Liberties Karnataka, a human rights organization, which had brought out a powerful report on human rights violations of hijras in Bangalore, criticized these judgments on the grounds that they essentially imply that one cannot choose one's sex and that one should remain within the sex into which one is born. But the question that arises, it seems to me, is more complicated. The judgments were not, in fact, reflecting on identity. What were the judgments saying? That it's about the political representation of identities. Who can make the claim to represent a particular identity? Because of course hijras can contest posts in general unreserved seats, and the judgments did not affect them. The identities of hijras was not in question. Is not in question, at least for us. The question is, can hijras represent women in constituencies reserved for women? Right? So that raises a whole bunch of questions for feminists, which have to do with hijra, because after all, when we say we want, when the women's movement says we want reservations for women, we're not talking of a biological identity. We are talking about a socio-political identity. That is, women as they are located inside a patriarchal structure. Are hijras located in the same way? There's an amazing essay by Urvashi Butalia in which she reflects on her friendship with Mona, a hijra, and how yes, Mona is marginal, but there are points at which Mona can draw on certain resources that a man could, but which Urvashi can't as a woman. So it's a complicated identity, the hijra. It's not, can you say that hijras would understand the social position of women, the subject position of women? This is the question that arises. I don't have an answer. I'm simply saying these are the kinds of questions that arise when you say who is the subject of feminist politics, because we are really talking about the experiences of the subject position called woman. And how is that to be worked out? If we understand materially located experience not as a given but as something produced by social, cultural and economic systems, any politics that seeks radical transformation would have to revision systems of political representation that could potentially represent newer and different kinds of experiences. I want to conclude by pointing to two things. One, that as I said, you can actually have kind of a Hindu right wing, and in India there is the emergence of a Hindu right wing gay lesbian politics. And what happens here is that it's attempting, so Ashok Rao Kavi is an example of this, Yiki Thadani often expresses this view, that is an attempt to claim legitimacy within the nation but by producing another kind of exclusion. And what these kinds of arguments are is that Hindus, in fact Hinduism has been much more open towards these practices. It is in fact Islam and the British so it's the opposite of what the Hindu right-wing position was in the 1990s. The argument is that Hinduism is open to all this. Hinduism is a tolerant religion, but Islam and Christianity and British colonialism have, in fact, made homosexuality unacceptable. So for him, for them, for these kinds of voices, the Muslim, so gay lesbian people can lay claim to the Hindu nation. It will be always the Muslim who's the eternal outsider. So there is that kind of view. So it's not as if as we know, as feminists know, you can be a feminist who stands for women's right to be in the army and implement the AFSPA in the Northeast. You could be a feminist who is opposed to AFSPA and says, well, I don't even want to ask the question, should women be in the army? Right? That question is not of any interest to me. So there are obviously different kinds of feminism and different kinds of queer politics. The final point is that I want to talk about is that if you look at two phenomena over the last sort of 2 decades, they've thrown into startling relief fractures in discourses of legitimate procreative sexuality. One is the large numbers of instances of intercaste love marriages, which are met with so much violence by khap panchayats and so on, or by parents who are by no means and who are very well off and who are very sophisticated city-living people who kill their daughter or kill the man the daughter is with for interreligious or intercaste marriages. That is one phenomenon. And the other phenomenon, so this is one, and kind of we must remember that Ambedkar had in fact seen the potential of intercaste marriage for what he called the annihilation of caste, and obviously that is being recognized, that there is a potential for the annihilation of caste and religious identity if people just go fall in love outside all these legitimate rules. So that's one kind of thing that we've been seeing. The other kind of challenge that we have been seeing particularly is the phenomenon of lesbian suicides. Now this is a very tragic and revealing phenomenon, and this is largely in Kerala but in many parts of India. We know there are lesbian suicides because they commit suicide and they leave a letter saying, I was in love with this woman, or both of us are in love and we are being forced to marry. So in both of these and all of these are ways in which legitimate procreative sexuality is being challenged. There are fractures, and we need to, any kind of radical politics has to knit together both of these in a feminist analysis which confronts the institution of the family head-on. We have to go beyond the kind of minority rights, privacy, civil liberties kind of framework in which the alphabets L, B, T, H, I, K, they go on proliferating endlessly outside the unchallenged heterosexual space. This is why I'm not satisfied with the Nepal solution of treating LGBT as a third gender category. I think that we need to recognize that an alliance between feminist and queer politics has to disrupt official autobiographies of the nation along all its dimensions. and only then can we think about a radical transformative practice. Thank you.
Now, may I invite you to sit.
Thanks very much, Nivedita, for very interesting and broad and far-reaching talk, I think. I'm just going to ask a few questions. Speaking as someone who came to age in the 90s myself. So the couple of questions are about the history that you draw out, and I guess I'm going to ask the obvious things. You talked about Shivananda Khan and the NAS Foundation, but I'm interested in particularly thinking about what is the role of diaspora and particularly consumption. I say this a little bit because well, in the 90s I worked for an HIV/AIDS organization, and I'm also interested in the history. Maybe if you can talk a little bit of the encounter between the middle class coming of age gay movement and this HIV/AIDS work, which happened in very different kinds of milieus. If you can talk a little bit about that. The other thing that was memorable about the 90s was that even as LGBT identities were blossoming, the anti-poverty struggles, at least in Delhi, were becoming harder and harder. And I'm going to take you seriously when you talk about a movement which has both the possibilities of radicalness and the possibilities of conservatism. And if you think about the 90s through this prism, because this was my experience of it. The last, I guess, comment or question I had was about two images from your talk. One is this image that you started with, which is Nepal, and this LGBT is a third gender. And then this image of being at the World Social Forum, where the Hijras want either to be a third gender or to be treated as women. And then this idea of queerness. And here I'm reflecting through an experience of living in America, where by the end, everyone who was gay wanted to get married and have kids, and there was this whole conversation about where is the queer in all of this. So I'm just wondering how to square these things. In particular, the Nepal, what has happened in Nepal, and this image from the World Social Forum, and then to ask about what is the ambit of queerness in 2014, in a situation where since the 90s, I mean in this generation, for example, when one goes to the gay parade or sees, it's a much larger community. So I'm curious, out of what is the ambit of this queer politics, or are we in a situation where, there's an island of queer politics and a sea of life, and which just happens to be gay? Thanks.
It seems they're too discussing, so I'm the last one.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, and also, for someone like me who doesn't work in any of this, has actually been also very enlightening as well. Well, I like the idea about how you also tried situating it again in the moment of the 1990s. Which makes it very interesting, because then when you think of the 1990s, definitely in India, you are thinking of other things. You're thinking of Kashmir, you're thinking of militancy, you're thinking of Ayodhya, you're thinking of so many struggles. And amidst that, so sometimes you do wonder that amidst all these struggles, it is quite something to think that how a politics based on questions of sexuality was able to actually gain visibility when you had so many other struggles sort of competing the national space. And again, the changes with the sort of liberalization of the market. Diaz asked sort of many questions, so I have some sort of minor questions to sort of ask. I do wonder though, and it's not meant to be kind of, when we talk about the 1990s and the idea, there's a lot of work definitely in neoliberalism which talks about the importance of how everything turns into consumption, and sexuality by itself, whether even heteronormative sexuality itself, is fitted into that frame of consumption. William Mazzarello's work on the Kama Sutra condoms was interesting because the catch line was people have sex, but when you use Kama Sutra condoms, you're making love. So it is how these products and everything fit in. So it's sexualities in general that get caught up in this question of consumption. At the same time, I often do feel a little uncomfortable when we try to say that, well, images of sexuality sort of float. Images of sexuality are anyway floating on and people see them on TV. in the 1990s. I was wondering if it would be possible to push even before liberalization. The fact of the matter is that people were sort of exposed to sort of images of sexuality. The difference perhaps would be that, I'm not a cinema scholar, but for example, one of the ways in which you could actually show sex in Hindi cinema for a long time was the rape sequence in that sense. And this was kind of exposing people to a very negative approach to sexuality, because this was where the main transformation happened. But these images have always been circulation. And secondly, how are these images received? Who are they received by? The people who are watching these images, like who are they, where they're located? And it's a question of audienceship that also comes in. Again, I really liked how you how you also situated in the context of the AIDS scare, and I think to some extent, again, in other parts of the world, AIDS was such a big moment in talking about the questions of sexuality and bringing the sort of constant approach as well. And again, the sort of range of voices that sort of come in. What I was rather curious about is, the erasure. There seems to be a tension also that comes in about the erasure of questions of homosexuality in the context of South Asian histories in the 19th century. And then you have someone like Kant who says that no, what we have now is a Western import, we need to unearth these histories, even though we're not doing a very good job of it. So this tension also seems to permeate. But I'm also wondering again, like the question about diasporas, you've had a similar debate on the kind of thing which Kant, Professor Nas Foundation does in the Middle East, like Joseph Massad's work on sexualities in the Middle East, where he argues that actually queer politics in Europe and North America sort of contribute to making the Middle East look backward because of their stance on sexuality, without recognizing that there's a different kind of politics. Well, not entirely different, but that there is a history of political engagement which they will not acknowledge. So there is a question of racism that comes in explicit. I'm wondering, even with these diasporic groups, is it their experience of racism in the context of, say, of Europe and North America that influences how they look at questions of engagements in South Asia? Again, I'm also just sort of considering the more general question about some of the challenges that face activists and scholars working in the field of in feminism and in questions of politics. I mean, I really appreciate the idea that you talk about counter-heteronormativity as very critical, and no one is actually questioning heteronormativity even before. But what are the kind of challenges you still face when you sort of present, when activists and scholars like yourself present your work to a public? I'll put it this way. The first time I actually heard you speak was in 2007 in Guaya Hall. I was just staying there for a few weeks in fieldwork, and you had come to give the students staying in Guaya Hall a lecture on feminism and questions of sexuality. I must confess, I don't remember exactly what you said. I was actually rather struck by how... I don't mean that way, let me just say. But what I remember was actually the students who heard you speak, and Guaya Hall is, as far as I remember, a male-only hostel. And what they came out of it was, one guy sitting next to me, kind of met me a few days, and like asking, is this what a feminist looks like? And I wasn't quite sure, I guess so, that was my response, I don't know. Because what he said is, so feminism is about becoming a lesbian, right? And it was actually, you realize, a challenge still, and this is 2007, Delhi University, the challenges of talking about, feminist politics, about politics based on sexuality still remain even in spaces we think are potentially liberal, if not liberal in practice. So what are the kind of challenges that we face now? And especially when you talk about Hindu, right-wing, gay, lesbian politics, this is again actually, this could be said to be a Western import, because you do have talks about gay Republicans, or you had very right-wing politicians in Europe like Pim Fortuyn, who would criticize immigrants by saying they're not liberal like us, and that kind of argument. So that actually looks like an import. So I wonder if there's a recognition of an importation of Western ideologies in the context of right-wing politics. And that's it. Sorry, it's a little scattered, but...
More questions. Let the students kind of ask, and then we'll write it back. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Ma'am, you spoke about, I think
we're recording actually.
The recording.
Ma'am, you spoke about how when terms like samlainik, etc. are used, but actually translating, it's almost as if you're translating in a sort of English idiom into local, sort of language that we speak, Hindi, that we speak on a daily basis. So I was curious to know whether there is really an Indian notion of homosexuality, so whether that kind of notion exists, or in fact, I didn't really understand your point about the erasure that you speak about. I mean, what got erased? Did an Indian notion of homosexuality ever exist for something to have been overwritten by sort of Western notion? So that's what I was curious to know.
That hand was there, yes, please. Yeah.
Nikki.
Identify yourself. After that,
Ma'am, continuing from your discussion about how feminist politics actually constructs
your name, country, and
Okay.
then
Myself, Vanita Singh, I'm an AMPhil scholar from University of Delhi. I'm working on disability and sexuality for my dissertation. I'm quite interested in looking, what you said about how feminist politics constructs an ideal subject for itself. So I'm interested in, like whatever fieldwork I have been doing, I get to know how homosexuality actually started as, people started looking at homosexuality as some sort of disease, a bodily disease that can be cured by going to Vedyas and Ojas and doctors and so on. And feminist politics have actually, countered this suggestion that no, homosexuality is not a disease. So by that, do you think that we are again constructing a category that diseased body and sexuality are polarized apart concept? Because how to bring diseased body then into the context of sexuality? And for example, like whatever works I have been reading, Susan Wendell and Scary and all, the body in pain, the diseased body, like Susan Wendell talks about how disabled body is considered often as a body in pain. So I'm like quite apprehensive of the fact that when feminism constantly keeps saying that no, queer, that minority, sexual minority section should not be seen as a body in pain or should not be seen as a diseased body. Are we again creating a category that body in pain cannot enjoy, cannot have pleasure, cannot have sexuality? Are we not again saying that body, pain is a temporary feeling? Pain is not how a normative body is supposed to perform pain. That is again, constructed. So I rarely see arguments that counters these questions or that poses certain questions. I would be really thankful if you could kind of, enlighten me on this. Thank you.
one more question. Yeah.
Excuse me. My name is Dharmen.
Sorry.
I want to know your.
No, sorry, I already asked her. After that, you.
Just to own it.
I'm Shubhurna, and my question is to add on to what Nikhil had asked about the erasure of certain histories of homosexuality and the lack of vocabulary that ensues out of it. I was wondering about, what came to my mind was sexology that was coming up in 19th century across English sexologies like Ian Block and anyway. And they are talking, there's this whole taxonomy of different kinds of sexualities as different kinds of pathologies. And from there is this influx of sexuality as a particular kind of discipline to be studied within India. There's this orientalization of sexology. And there is that moment in which C.M. Nain talks about this, where habit and an excess of habit then becomes different sexuality. So there's chalbazi, guddebazi, and then there is laundebazi. And he says that within that laundebazi you have that vocabulary for homosexuality. I've forgotten what you call lesbianism. I don't know that talent. But there is that point at which bazi and euphemism of sexuality becomes a particular form of habit, and in that gets initiated into everyday practices. So I was wondering, then how far has history been erased at all?
Good afternoon.
She'll take questions now, and then your turn.
I'll just take this round and then. These are just wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you. They're not, all questions. This is all contributing to a conversation. So let me start with Dia. I think Dia, you've raised some, obviously this can only add texture to my account. Partly it was also limited, by time, but for example, the three questions that I really noted down as were really something that I should engage with. The idea of consumption, which Ankur also raised. The question of poverty receding in the 1990s as this movement is coming up. And what is the ambit of queer politics today? I can see them as linked, and in a way I think you're actually pointing to a certain discomfort that is very much present within the queer movement in India today, that now that we can speak our name, now that the Delhi High Court judgment has happened, whatever happens in the Supreme Court, gay, lesbian can be completely depoliticized as a choice, as who you have sex with, but that doesn't mean that you want anything else to be changed. You are perfectly all for capitalist development, and you don't want to take on the burden of anti-big dams, you don't want to bother about nuclear energy, you just want to have sex with the person you want to have sex with. Now, this is the coming of age of the queer movement, and I think anyone who has been involved in the organizing of Gay Pride knows that increasingly there are questions about sponsorship. Absolute Vodka is willing to sponsor the Gay Pride. So what does the other kind of queer movement do, which is opposed to corporate sponsorship and so on? Now, this is a moment that, as I said, I think feminists had to encounter fairly early on, that when you get politicized as a feminist, you don't necessarily get politicized in all the other ways in which many of us are politicized. So you have extremely politically active women in the Hindu right wing. You have extremely politically active women participating in the Gujarat violence against Muslims, preparing, as you must have seen those pictures of them preparing missiles and projectiles sitting on their terrace, fire bombs and so on. You can have them being completely anti-Mandal reservations. You can have them white racist and supremacist, and so on and so forth. So similarly, queer politics is not everyone who is queer. So this is actually the question of the subject of feminist politics, or the subject of queer politics. I think we have come to recognize gradually that the subject of our politics is not the biological woman. The subject of queer politics is not the person who has sex in a non-heterosexual way, but the subject of our politics has to be called into being, and it is the end point of our politics. So I really think that this is the predicament. So as Gautam Bhan says, who is such a visible queer activist, but he actually has to be outed, by the way, as an academic. He has a PhD from Berkeley. So I often say everyone knows him as a gay man, but doesn't know him as someone who's worked on urban poverty and slums and so on. And he says every time he's asked to speak about queer politics, he says, I want to talk about slum demolition, nobody wants to hear. So there is a way in which a certain kind of feminism and a certain kind of gay politics has become acceptable to a consumerist, consumptionist public, and it will be part of our politics to continuously resist that and to continuously show that our politics is fractured by all these other, particularly by class. So I think by class, caste, and so on. And I think that is what feminists have had to do, and that is what now the new Feminist Queer Alliance will have to do. But I think you have pointed to some fairly intractable issues. Ankur, thank you. So that addresses your consumption point. But the other interesting thing was what you said, so many other things were happening in the 90s. They are linked. You see, that is the interesting thing. If you look at the protests outside Regal and so on, who were the people there? These were the people who had since 1992, since 1984, been part of anti-communal politics. Who had actually protested the demolition of the Babri Masjid, who were mobilized very strongly against Hindu right-wing politics. These are the people who have fought against slum demolitions and so on. So that's what I was trying to say, that at that moment, outside Regal kind of a thing, I mean, it happened in different parts, and it was more continuous than one moment. But in a way, it could have been the same kind of mobilization for a variety of issues of that period. So democratic rights, anti-Hindu right wing, but suddenly also explicitly gay lesbian voices. But many of those gay lesbian people would have been quietly and in an unarmed way being part of these movements too. So in fact, that moment reflects the entire actually gamut of people who've been talking about democracy in Kashmir and all of that. So it's actually an interesting moment, and that is what we call queer politics, right? So, so this is where the problem arises when this politics doesn't mesh with the politics of the new entrance into gay lesbian politics, who simply want to march proudly on the streets, have a drink with their girlfriends or boyfriends, and not have to answer any questions. They don't really want to talk about Hindu right wing. They don't. So they're not politicized in that way. Just as all women who are drinking in pubs are not politicized as feminists, but they represent something for us, and so the actual political movement is much narrower. I think that's been always the case. But it's not narrower in the sense of more elite. In fact, these are the more elite voices. In fact, our alliances will be with the less elite sections. So, I think both Dia and Ankur talked about the fact that 90s was not, and not just Dia, I think someone else, I'll just come to that, about it's not that sex was not known or that sex was not shown prior to the 90s. I did, of course, I think I did very quickly hint at that when I said it's not that sex was not spoken about. Sex has always been spoken about in different kinds of ways. But it was not spoken about in this way, and I would make a distinction between television and cinema. You're right to say that rape scenes were shown on cinema, but the fact that inside the space where you're sitting and having dinner with your grandfather, that same rape scene is being shown, or other things are being shown, or white women in bikinis are being shown. I don't mean that, I'm simply not saying that it corrupted or people became used to it. There's a banalization. It just becomes something you see and it passes you by. You're talking about other things and this is happening. Miss World, for example, is being shown. All those women in bikinis. It's not. So my point is not that it becomes some kind of healthy discourse around sexuality started, by no means. I'm simply saying that it was a moment in which sex became speakable, partly through AIDS and so on, but partly through the opening up of television to foreign channels, where it just became something more routine and everyday, and it could be talked about. As far as Khan and Masad are concerned, you're absolutely right. I am completely in agreement with you that their location in the that their location in the West and the racism and their framing of it within racism and imperialism is definitely the motivating force behind their refusal to engage with, in fact, local movements in the global south who are using these terms and appropriating these terms and working with them. So for Khan and Masad, it can only be an imperialist move. So they call themselves gay. They don't have a problem. You can't call yourself gay. I can't call myself gay if I live in India, but living, because that would be I'm succumbing to imperialist instigation. But they can call themselves gay because that's their natural identity. So there are levels and levels of location politics here. And Joseph Masad and Khan, I think, do in fact represent that kind of universalizing move where their experience of imperialism and racism is just directly transposed onto the global south. And that's why, for example, I think that was very insightful, and I think that was quite a useful way of the challenges of talking about feminism and the person in Goya Hall who said, oh gosh, is that what feminism is? Oh my god, are all women going to become lesbian? Hamara kya hoga? See, I think there are literally hundreds of people, I should say thousands of people all over this country, all over India anyway, and perhaps all over the world, who are engaging different kinds of audiences in these ways. Teachers do it in their way. The person who invited me to Goya Hall was doing it in his way, right? I mean, I didn't go there to take a class. He wanted Goya Hall to be exposed to these ideas. the Wahal hostel boys. But there are class teachers, there are school teachers, there are NGO activists who are conducting sexuality workshops in villages. So I think there is a kind of ground level transformation of common sense that I actually believe has taken place over the past decade and a half. So that when this big mobilization took place around the Delhi gang rape, it was not a mobilization, in fact, of any sort that we recognize. Because we are used to, let's say, the big mobilizations around Mathura, around the Muslim women's bill in India, right? Those were mobilizations in the classic level sense. These were self-mobilized, self-organized, and so many of them, I mean at least 50 to 60% of them, were actually saying, men and women both, were saying impeccably feminist things. We will dress the way we want, we have a right to public spaces, we want the police to be accountable. So they were saying feminist things. If you actually stopped and asked them, are you feminist? They might or might not have said they're feminist. But this has become common sense now. There's been a certain ground level transformation. So the challenges are always to engage in conversation, and the dangers are always that you might say something and something else will be picked up, but the conversation will go on. And the conversations do carry on. And I think this is something that I'm also sort of an inveterate optimist despite everything. And someone said I'm oddly cheerful about feminism, and I am oddly cheerful about feminism. I don't actually tell the story of feminism as, oh my God, patriarchy is so huge and we're always struggling and so on. We're struggling, and there's always an outside. There's an outside to capitalism, there's an outside to patriarchy. So the challenges are to engage in conversation to the extent possible. And I think that's happening, and it's happening at so many levels, and I can actually see that has really happened. Now, the Hindu right wing, whether it's using a Western paradigm, actually I don't think it's particularly Western. In fact, I would tie up the Hindu right kind of argument to Israel's pink washing, which I don't know if you have heard of. Now, Israel claims, this is one of its big moves, to say that, of course, you know, or at least I'm very clear in my position on Israel, is that Israel has simply taken over Palestinian land, and it's an apartheid state. So I'm placing that out there. That's another debate. Israel is an apartheid state, and Zionism is apartheid. But one of the things that Israel says in order to counter the Palestinian struggle is that we're the only democracy in West Asia. Look at all these Arab Muslim nations. They have nothing, they have no democracy. We are the only state that recognizes gay rights. And this has been challenged by anti-Zionists inside Israel also, which is what? So the argument is not that you don't respect gay rights. It is that you respect gay rights of Jewish people or Israeli people. So this is not about Jewishness, it's about the Israeli nation state. And similarly, the Hindu right wing, so this is the kind of move to use, it's like when the British colonial government said we have to be in India because they're treating their women so badly. Right? We have to be there to protect their women from sucking. Or America has to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan to get women out from the grips of the Taliban. We know this strategy. It's an old strategy. So the Hindu right is going to protect Muslim women from Muslim men. Israel is going to protect gay people all over West Asia from their own. So there is a way in which these kinds of arguments are also used to justify certain extremely anti-democratic setups where this one small thing is given. So as an Israeli anti-Zionist said, that when a Palestinian passes an Israeli checkpost, the fact that the Israeli soldier is gay and the Palestinian is gay is completely irrelevant. The gay Palestinian is treated as contemptuously and with as much brutality as the straight Palestinian. The gayness of the Israeli guard has nothing to do with anything at that point. But of course the Hindu right voice in India is not so powerful. These are just very, very small voices, and by and large there's a huge critique of them. But it's the same strategy. Nikhil, about what really got erased, and that really ties up to Suparna's question as well. See, so to start with Suparna's question, did it really get erased? When you say histories get erased, you don't really mean they are erased beyond. I mean, if they're so erased, we wouldn't know there was a history that was erased. So when you talk about erasures of histories, we're talking about the ways in which mainstream narratives render some stories invisible, which can always be retrieved. And when you retrieve them, it doesn't mean that they were not erased or that there was no attempt to erase them. So when you say that what is an Indian notion of homosexuality, I think thanks Suparna by talking about Naeem's example was in a way addressing your question, but this is exactly what Ruth-Anita and Salim Kibai do, this is what Geeti Tharani does. It's not whether there were Indian practices of homosexuality, because there is no such thing as Indian till the late 19th century, by which time homosexuality has pretty much been, on this landmass that we now call landmass and islands and so on, that we now call by various names of nation states. There were, as with all humanity, innumerable practices of sex and desire which did not conform to heterosexuality as natural. There were innumerable practices. There were different names for them. Sometimes the names, so londebazi is one way of talking about gay sex, gandu. So you're talking about the actual practice. So now these terms have just become impossible to say. There are to say without, because they become terms of abuse. But there are terms, Ruth-Anita lists several about female practices. So there are words which conjure up the sound of licking. There are words like this. So when you say, what is you just talk about the practice. You did not think of it as one overarching identity. It's not your identity. This is a point which Foucault makes, right? That you're not a homosexual, you're a person, or a heterosexual. You're a person who has different kinds of sex at different points, and I could imagine a situation in which you might all have desires for different kinds of people at different times and have different kinds of sex at different times. So it's not one Indian notion of homosexuality. There were practices of sex which had different names, and obviously they would differ from the south to the north, to Kerala, to Tamil, to Malayalam, to etc. So there were a variety of terms. But now there is a nation state, there is one language, now there is a politics. So there's an attempt to talk about homosexuality, which has its disadvantages and its advantages. So that every moment produces its resistance and produces the constraints. So the odd thing in the Delhi High Court, in the Supreme Court, where they're awaiting judgment, is that in fact the judges in the Supreme Court kept insisting that Section 377 is not about homosexuality at all. It's about practices against the order of nature. So this is a very bizarre scenario where they were talking like post-structuralist language. And the homosexual rights people were saying all the things that we've always said we shouldn't say. That people are homosexual, etc. We've been wanting to say it's practices, etc. But the judges are saying, but anything doesn't really affect homosexuals. And therefore they wanted to leave 377 in. They want to not repeal it. By saying that after all it really refers to, it's actually impossible to say what it refers to. And we needed to protect young children from child sexual abuse, which of course is no longer the case because there's a new child sexual abuse law. But this is what I'm trying to say, there's a very peculiar way in which all our political interventions sometimes get picked up and used in peculiar ways. So when I say it got erased, I mean that there's a deliberate move to render these things unspeakable, invisible, etc. So Anita, I think you're on it's a peculiar problem you set up for yourself, which is not a problem really, in the sense that first of all, I think you shouldn't conflate body. I'm not sure I'm looking at Anita. Can you just raise your hand? Oh, you're there. I'm looking at another person. Sorry. I don't think you should conflate body pain with diseased body. First of all, I think they're two, conceptually and philosophically two different things. Now, secondly, when one argues that such and such thing is not a disease, does this mean and why should it imply that there is no such thing as disease? It doesn't imply that at all. When you say that homosexuality is not a disease, all you're saying is that homosexuality doesn't need intervention like cancer does to be cured. That it's not a situation that needs to be cured. But it doesn't mean that you don't recognize the importance and the space for the body which has a disability, the space for recognizing something as a disease, and how disease should be and how body in pain should be engaged with. So this is actually a straw man you've set up. It's actually a predicament that you're not in. You don't need to be in this predicament. To say homosexuality is not a disease is not to say that all diseased people are to be treated as outcasts. Not at all. Not at all. It is simply to say that this language of pathology suggests that this is a situation that can be changed. But we do agree that certain things can be classified. Tuberculosis is a disease. Depression is a kind of disease. You don't want to live in depression. But you can actually healthily say depression is a disease. It's by saying that means that you don't have to be ashamed of going to see a counselor. You would go to see a doctor if you had tuberculosis. You're going to see a doctor. Perhaps counseling might help you if you're sort of so deeply depressed that you are dysfunctional. On the other hand, certain kinds of depression can be very creative. So we might want to say depression is not a disease. But when you say something is not a disease, it's not to say that we don't take disease seriously and all disease is bad and they should be shunned. So I don't think you have to be worried about that.
I want to ask this, what is your opinion regarding rights of homosexuals to adopt children? Is it allowed anywhere in the world? And the third question is there any objective study which suggests that these children can be brought up normally without any conflict, like in terms of juvenile crimes or fights in family? Or is there any possibility of child sex abuse also, if this is allowed?
Yes. You want to draw?
Yeah, exactly.
After that you come.
Ma'am, I'm Chayanika and I'm doing my master's at the South Asian University. These are just some off-the-track thoughts that I've tried to concretize into a question. Ma'am, considering that the caste-based society that we have in India, where there are some injunctions about karmic repentance and rebirth, in such circumstances, the condition and the plight of women and transgenders is something that we should take into account. But to a great extent, what it has been seen is that it is a pyramid or a kind of structure that's created. We see that women somewhere fare above the transgender when it comes to such aspects like karmic injunctions and rebirth. Do you think that such kind of like a false sense of empowerment that women get vis-a-vis the transgenders is driving the spade further between the women and the LGBTs movement? Thank you.
Ma'am, I'm Srinivasan, doing Masters in IR, SAE. I just want to make one point as a contribution to this seminar that regarding, I'm from Tamil Nadu, the issue, the empowerment of transgenders in Tamil Nadu, it was remarkable. The acceptance of transgender people to the society, the before and after the law, and the politics. In the acceptance of those people in mainstream media and film industry, even transgender peoples contested in elections. There were the third gender was included in gender specification in the application forms of education institutions. There are many things. But this Tamil Nadu case is example for beneficiary in the good sense. Why we people are not taking this to apply for other societies in India or beyond India in South Asia, but the Western people are who are outside, they are referring to Tamil Nadu and this empowerment of transgenders issue and all. But why we can't do within our region? Just kind of. Thank you.
So that means, yes, homosexual people are allowed to adopt in many parts of the world. In India, nobody is allowed to adopt, right, except Hindus. So whether you're heterosexual or not, except because of the new Juvenile Justice Act, under the Juvenile Justice Act you can adopt. So the question of adoption is complicated for non-homosexual people as well as heterosexual people. But let's, so in India, by and large, it's more difficult to adopt. Everybody finds it more difficult to adopt. Till 2006, and with the new Juvenile Justice Act, we can adopt. Now the question really is this. Just ask, ask yourself, what is the basis of the way in which you're posing the question? So let's take, number one, let's take adoption by people who are heterosexual, who are, sorry, every time you move your head, you cover the person I'm looking at, so then they're like, so you have to say like this, I'm sorry. So let's ask the same question about a man married to a woman in a proper marriage, they cannot have children, they adopt a child. Don't you think the question of child sexual abuse could arise there? How do we know what that man will do to the little girl or what the man or woman will do to the little boy? The question of child sexual abuse arises inside families who are biologically related. Most cases of child sexual abuse, actually if you know, most cases, 90% I think I could say quite safely, are carried out by fathers, uncles, brothers, cousins, largely by men. And they're carried out by actual biological family members. So child sexual abuse is a problem across the board. It doesn't only arise in the context of homosexual people. So if one is worried about child sexual abuse, one has to actually look around, and if you talk to any woman in this room, either she herself or she will know some other woman who as a child was abused by a trusted family member. Anushka Shankar talked about it, Ravi Shankar's daughter publicly talked about it, right? Nilanjana's publicly talked about it. Recently I read that on her blog post, Nilanjana Roy, right? So these are done by trusted people who, see, this is the question is arising in your head because somehow for you still, homosexual people have to prove themselves to be human. As if the violence in heterosexual society isn't enough. Right? So the question is, are children safe in families? Or there should be ways in which we can talk about children's safety in families. There is no more or greater reason why homosexual people will abuse a child than heterosexual people abuse. The question is, there's also no more or better reason why adoptive parents of any sort will abuse a child as opposed to biological parents. Fathers rape their daughters routinely. Don't you read 2 stories in the paper every single day? Every single day. There are at least 2 stories, and these are the stories that we come to hear because the mother had the guts to go to the police. Half the time the mothers are keeping quiet because they don't know what to do. So you must ask yourself why this question came to your mind in the context of homosexuals only, when if you just stop and think, these are questions that are across the board. So there's much more violence inside biological families and among heterosexual people than there are. So I think we need to not start. Why don't you start with the assumption that homosexual people are like you? I'm assuming that you're not, otherwise because we're talking about them like them, right? So why don't you start with the assumption that they are like us, that everybody, they just have desire for people of the same sex. That doesn't make them evil, mad, perverted, any more than all human beings are evil, mad and perverted. Right? There would be evil, mad and perverted homosexuals just as much as so many straight people are evil, mad and perverted. So you should, I think, be more open no, let me just answer these and we can come back. I don't know, Chainika, was that your name? I don't understand actually where that's coming from because that karmic injunctions give women a higher role. I don't even think so. I don't know why you say that. Where is that? Like, you'd have to tell me now. Because if you look at all the myths, transgender is a terrific position of power. I mean, Arjuna, I can think of so many when he becomes Sayandri, right? Arjuna becomes Sayandri. There are just so many, the famous Shikhandi. So I don't actually understand why you said that, and I don't think it's true that karmic injunctions place women over homosexuals at all. I don't think that's true anyhow. Srinivasan, yes. What Tamil Nadu thinks today, the world should think tomorrow. I agree with you.
From my observation, transgenders are one of the vote banks. They can influence also. This is one point.
No, see, I think what you said, I think they're called Aravani or something, right? In Tamil?
Yeah, Aravani. Now it was using female language. It was more respectful word. Then previous.
So, I think we all know that traditional communities of transgender people, Hijras for example, or the Aravallis in Tamil Nadu, they've had a kind of a semi-religious status. They perform certain functions, ritual functions and all of that. So we need to, now the problem is that when such a society is transforming, when those kinds of ritual-based societies are transforming, obviously Hijras want to just also live. They don't always want to be thinking in terms of blessing you when your child is born or whatever. They want to get jobs, they want to just live like anybody else. They just want to be Hijras and live like anybody else, right? So I agree with you that any model that can treat all people as citizens regardless of what their body is and what their sexual desire is. Such a society we should try and replicate all over the world, including in other parts. So yeah, I completely agree that if my sense is that in Tamil Nadu, if there is in fact such a stronger acceptance, modern acceptance of Hijras, that's probably because of a very powerful mobilization, so because of political movement. I'm not sure about vote banks. I think this vote bank, as a political science person, I reject the idea of vote banks. There is no vote bank. No, there's nothing called a vote bank. Because it's not as if all Muslims, all women vote. So the other day, one of those insane journalistic queries, ma'am, do you think there's a women's vote bank? And I'm supposed to give an answer in 2 seconds, right? No, there isn't. There's no vote bank of any sort. People vote locally, differently. A Hijra based in Kerala will have other requirements from a Hijra based in Gujarat, etc., etc. So I would say that the vote bank is not a very useful conceptual category at all. But the rest of what you said, I agree.
Myself, Ranjit, I am pursuing Masters in Gender Studies from Indira Gandhi National Open University. My question is particularly related to the idea which you put forward regarding the fluidity and the relativity of identity. How far this question has been addressed in the Indian feminist context, especially in terms of while they deal with the question of homosexuality as a political movement. Whereas there are different kinds of historical claims which comes, like as you said, there is one kind of a claim from the Hindu right wing which goes to the pre-colonial phrases. At the same time, there is a kind of another argument which you're mentioning about NAS founder.
This is another NAS,
yeah, you mentioned the London-based one, which seems to be carrying a very strong connotation of the post-colonial politics and all. So in this condition, how far this particular questions has been addressed in the Indian feminist movement, and just one more related query. Yeah. And particularly to the moment of homosexuality, the question of homosexuality I'm asking. And one more question, I think somewhere I missed out your argument on the Nepal case. The very process of recognition as a category by a state instrument, state process. What was the problem which you were mentioning in that? I didn't get it. Is it the same issue of this relativity and the fluidity of the identities which also plays a role there? What was your argument? I missed out.
Okay, so the women's movement hasn't. So there's not one women's movement. There's not one feminism. There are more debates inside and among feminists than there are between feminists and non-feminists. So you put a bunch of feminists in the room, there'll be heated, violent fights. So that, let's be very clear that there's no one feminist position. So there is as far as this fluidity of identity argument is concerned, this is definitely sort of the more radical stand of the women's movement. If you take the mainstream left in the women's movement, there's a very strong left presence also in the women's movement. They moved from homophobia, which is to say that homosexuality, so there are different ways, forms of homophobia in the left. One used to be, one is to say, so in the 80s and so on, one is to say that homosexuality is a Western aberration, it's bourgeois, it's about bourgeois kids, the real issue is poverty, that kind of thing. So homophobia could be like that, also it's not natural, it's a disease, all of that. But now, pretty much you don't find those kind of homophobic arguments being publicly made. Although how anybody will respond if their daughter says I'm lesbian is always another matter. But publicly there's no homophobic statement. But their position would be not about fluidity of argument, of identity at all. Their position would be the civil rights argument. That there are gay and lesbian people and transgender people, they have civil rights like the rest of us, and they should get those civil rights and they should be recognized as full and equal citizens of the country. Now, what I think that many of us feel that this is not radical enough, because and this is exactly my problem with the Nepal situation. And I mean, I'm saying this in a context of fair degree of ignorance, so I don't know. Apart from that one gay member of parliament, I haven't read anything about what queer groups in Nepal are saying. So I don't know what the debate in Nepal is. So I must make it very clear that I only know this very little bit about Nepal. But what I have understood is, this much I know is correct, that they have decided to recognize it as a third category. So my problem with it is precisely this, that I think that we have to challenge the naturalness of heterosexuality at every level. We have to recognize that heterosexuality is compulsory. That it's not as if we are born heterosexual and then some people just happen to be either born homosexual or become homosexual. But heterosexuality is learned, kept in place. So I'm not saying homosexuality is more natural than heterosexuality. I'm simply saying all forms of sexuality are learned. And the very existence of Section 377 and the very existence of a range of controls should indicate to us that heterosexuality is not natural. Because if it were natural, why do you need so many laws and so many prohibitions? Okay, breathing is natural. Do you need a law telling you to breathe? Hunger is natural. Do you need a law telling you should eat? So if it's so natural to have sex with someone of only a so-called opposite gender, then why do you need a law saying you can't have sex with anybody else? Then naturally people will have sex only with. It should tell you that there is a real and the fear. What is the fear? What is it that patriarchy wants? It wants a controlled family, heterosexual patriarchal family, which can pass on identities in a particular way, caste identities in particular in India, but also religious identities, also property. So this particular family is the linchpin of a highly inequitable society. And heterosexuality is at the heart of that, the assumed naturalness of heterosexuality. So that's my worry with the Nepal situation, that now you have to, for example, why do you have to recognize it as a category of citizen? Why should you not say, South Africa, for example, has a very different way of doing it. Sexual orientation shall not be, like when we say there shall be no discrimination on grounds of this and this, or sexual orientation. That's it. You only need to say that. You don't have to recognize it as a third category, because that is actually producing a situation in which people have to either prove they're heterosexual or not heterosexual. And I mean, our whole argument is that people are naturally queer, that you could have different kinds of relationships. There's nothing natural about heterosexuality. That situation makes heterosexuality look natural. That's my worry. But I'm really open to learning more about the Nepal situation.
Okay, I think we have last.
Ma'am, my question, it's not of a question, more of a confusion I have. The question is, why you said that the Hijra community, they want themselves to be related to the women, but why not the men? My question is because, is there a feeling among the feminist movement that if the Hijra community is related to the women, they can gain equality, or the discrimination can be less, or this notion further gives us a patriarchal view where there's a feeling that no, the Hijra community cannot be equated with men because it is a long way to go.
It's not the feminists who are saying that Hijras should be equated with women. Okay, so let's be very clear. Hijras there are two positions inside Hijra communities. And we should also make a distinction, and I want to say a little bit about that, between traditional Hijra communities and transgender people who could be you or me. You don't know that I'm transgender. You don't know. I'm presenting myself here as a woman. You don't know whether I was born a man, unless I say it. A lot of transgender people want to say it in order to trouble the gender field. But many people just don't want to go into it once they've gone through the various processes and become a... So that's a different thing that involves money, that involves hormonal blah blah, all of that. If you take the traditional Hijra community, the Hijra community, I suggest all of you who are very intrigued by Hijras, why don't you read Revati, the autobiography of a Hijra, by Revati. It's translated into English. It was written in Tamil. It's published by Zuban. It's a cheap edition. It's easily available. A lot of Hijras speak like this. Once I was on a panel with her, and she said that I always felt like a woman. I was born a boy, but I always felt like a woman. So many Hijras say this. And in Hindi, they speak of themselves as "मैं करती हूँ," etc. And they wear sarees and so on. So that is what they choose to do. The feminists have to just engage with them in whatever way that they present themselves. Now, so that's why many of them, some of them contested the seats reserved for women. And I was pointing out to the issues in that. Now, when Revati said I felt like a woman and I feel like a woman and so on, and we were on this panel, and I said, you know, Revati, what is intriguing for me कि मुझे कभी नहीं लगा कि मैं औरत जैसी हूँ, और मुझे all the time I had to fight with this thing that I'm being born and I'm called a girl, I'm called a woman. I don't feel those. What is it to feel like a woman? I've always struggled with this thing. When Sushmita Sen says, when she got the Miss Universe, something about I'm so proud of being a woman, and I'm like, what is it, right? So most feminists will tell you, and most people will tell you, that I don't actually get what it is to be a woman, and I suspect I'm not succeeding half the time. So I said, I don't understand what you mean, and why did you feel so strongly? So she said, well, that's how I felt, and she defined being a woman in terms of I wanted to dress like this, I wanted to go in the morning, carrying my bag, I wanted to go to work like other women going to office. Okay, now, one way of looking at it is to say, oh, she got it all wrong, they don't understand, it's better to be not gendered, why do you think it's so great to be a woman? No, but you have to take the position seriously. So I understood that but she never says I'm a woman. I'm a Hijra. She doesn't say I'm a woman. She said when I was a man, I didn't feel comfortable, and now I'm a Hijra, I'm happy. Right? She doesn't pretend to be a woman. She says I'm a Hijra because I didn't want to be a man and I wanted to be like a woman. Now that troubles your gender field, and I'm perfectly happy with that. Right? It raises questions that she's refusing to be woman, she's refusing to be man. And so I asked her, what about Hijra as third gender, and what do you think of that? She said, well, and this was, I thought, a remarkable statement. She said, जो तुम कहती हो तुम वो. Whatever you say you are, that's what you are. So if you say I'm a third gender, now this is to answer the Nepal question, this is actually such a productive strategy. Let's not have any gender. You could be anything. Today you were saying, so right now, I know at least two people who call themselves transgender, people like us, not traditional communities, but people like us who studied in these universities, who say, I'm transgender. They didn't do anything. They didn't take any hormonal injections, they didn't take any surgical interventions. They were born and given the identity of woman, and they said, we no longer feel women, but we don't feel like men, we are transgender. They identify as transgender people. So these are different kinds of ways in which this very neat world of very obvious men and obvious women is being troubled. And I think I really want us to think about how much work goes into, and this is what I was trying to tell you also, to making this world look naturally like this. So the interventions are cultural, the interventions are surgical, the interventions are medical, there are any number of interventions that go into, because remember that sex is assigned at birth, after that you're never tested for gender. It's assigned at birth, and it's assigned on the basis of whether the doctor can see something that looks like a penis or she can't. If she can see something that looks like a penis, you're called a boy. After that you perform gender. You perform your gender till the day of your death. If you have breasts, you go to a plastic surgeon and get the breast removed. Haven't you seen? You can go to a plastic surgeon, women can get their breasts augmented, men can go to get breast fat removed. It's very common for men to have breast fat, because there are male and female hormones in all our bodies. So my point is that there's a lot of effort that goes into making us look like this. And it is kept in place by a very powerful disciplinary order.
No, I'm sorry. We have, because if we end this, I also have to attend a meeting. If you can carry it on in the dimension, that's not more. So that's where you carry it on. I'm sorry. I think I was also a good chairman. We enjoyed ourselves. It was very deeply sensitive and complex, as she always is. And I'm sure somebody will thank on behalf of Social Department, but I must thank you. It was such a brilliant presentation. It kept me thinking all along. Only one minor thing I thought was Arjun or Dhuvan Nagar. That's it. Certainly was Dhuvan. That was my correction. Otherwise, many things I can agree with. There are also many things I learned. So always a learning experience because I am not reading these areas of interested. She's reading and writing. So this is a great learning experience personally for me. Thank you so much.
I thank everyone for their presence. Thank you, ma'am, so much. It was very enlightening. Thank you, sir, for chairing the meeting. Thank you.